Her heart raced, her palms sweated, but no one challenged her. They just listened. For the first time, they really listened. And when she left that room, she didn't feel pride or victory. She felt peace, because she had honored herself, not in defiance but in truth. There was also a man who always did the right thing. He followed the rules, checked the boxes, stayed quiet. He thought being good would protect him, that if he did everything right, he'd be loved, respected, safe. But life doesn't work that way. Goodness, when rooted in fear, becomes a prison. He began to notice the disconnect between his inner world and the life he had built. He didn't recognize the reflection staring back at him, not because he had changed, but because he hadn't. He remembered loving music as a child. He used to sing to himself in his room, dreaming of stages, of freedom, of expression. But that version of him had been silenced, grown out of, replaced by something more practical. One day alone at home, he played an old song, and something in him cracked open. He sang, loudly, off-key, passionately, and for the first time in years, he felt alive. Not successful, not admired, alive. He began to sing every morning, not for anyone else, for himself. And that simple act became a lifeline, a way of remembering the self he had left behind. Healing often starts with remembering, not just the pain, but the parts of you that existed before the pain, before the conditioning, before the masks. You remember the version of you that dreamed big, laughed freely, spoke boldly, and you grieve. You grieve for the years you spent disconnected. You grieve for the times you betrayed yourself for acceptance. You grieve for the moments you knew better, but didn't feel strong enough to choose better. And then, in the midst of that grief, something beautiful happens. Forgiveness. You begin to forgive yourself, not because you did everything right, but because you were doing the best you could with what you knew. You forgive the silence, the compliance, the self-abandonment. You stop punishing yourself for the ways you survived, and in that forgiveness, you create space for gentleness. You stop demanding perfection from yourself. You start showing up with more softness, more presence, more care. You begin to realize that healing isn't about fixing yourself. It's about befriending yourself. It's about making space for the full spectrum of your humanity, the joy, the rage, the fear, the hope. You stop labeling your emotions as good or bad. You start seeing them as messengers, each one showing up with something to teach you. You learn to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to fix it. You learn to breathe through the ache instead of running from it. You learn to trust that your body knows how to heal, if only you stop interrupting it. You start being more intentional with your energy. You notice how certain people leave you feeling drained, while others make you feel expansive. You start choosing quality over quantity, depth over performance. You begin to value the quiet moments, the slow mornings, the deep conversations, the honest exchanges. You realize that peace isn't found in doing more. It's found in needing less. And with this clarity comes new standards, not just for others, but for yourself. You stop tolerating your own avoidance, your own excuses, your own patterns that keep you stuck. You begin holding yourself accountable with compassion, not criticism. You learn to catch yourself when you start slipping into old stories. You say, "That's not me anymore." And you keep going, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, because the hardest part of healing is choosing it again and again. Even when it's inconvenient, you begin to see your life as a sacred responsibility, not something to be endured, but something to be created. You stop waiting for permission to be happy. You stop waiting for everything to be perfect. You realize that life isn't about reaching a destination. It's about being present for the journey. Every moment, every breath, every truth, even the uncomfortable ones, especially the uncomfortable ones. You learn to celebrate yourself, not just when you achieve something, but when you honor your boundaries, when you tell the truth, when you choose rest, when you choose joy. You stop waiting for someone else to clap for you. You learn how to clap for yourself. And in doing so, you stop performing. You start living. And maybe one day, you'll look around and realize that the life you're living feels different. Not louder, not flashier, just more aligned. You'll see the way your space reflects your peace, the way your relationships reflect your values, the way your choices reflect your truth. You'll feel at home, not because you've reached some final destination, but because you've finally come home to yourself. And that home, it's not a place, it's not a title, it's not a role, it's a feeling, a knowing. He wept for how the world taught him to dim his light, to sit still, to be quiet, to perform. And then, in a moment that felt like grace, he made a vow, not a grand one, not a dramatic one, but a simple one. I will not abandon you again. From that day forward, everything changed. He began to create, not for profit, not for praise, but for pleasure. He painted. He wrote poems that didn't rhyme. He hummed songs he made up on the spot. He talked to trees, and they responded, not in words, but in presence. He started writing letters to the parts of himself he had neglected, the angry one, the sad one, the one who still held shame. He didn't try to fix them. He just let them speak. And through those letters, he began to understand that all of him was worthy. Not just the polished parts, not just the ones that made others proud, all of him. He learned to slow down, not just in movement, but in thought. He stopped rushing through conversations, stopped multitasking every moment. He gave his full attention to whatever was in front of him, a leaf, a breeze, a stranger's eyes. And in doing so, time seemed to stretch. Life became richer. The ordinary became holy. And he no longer sought meaning. He created it. Sometimes people from his past would ask him what changed. They'd ask what he was doing now, where he was going, what his plans were. And he would smile softly, the way trees smile when the wind passes through them, and say, I'm just here. And most of them didn't understand, because we live in a world obsessed with the future, with metrics, with goals. But he had let all of that go, not because he gave up, but because he finally understood that being present is the most radical act of all. And the strange thing was, the more he surrendered, the more life opened up. Not in material ways, but in soulful ways. He found people who resonated with his silence, who didn't need him to perform, who showed up with their hearts open and their egos quiet. And in their presence, he didn't feel pressure. He felt peace. He realized he didn't need a crowd. He needed a circle. People who saw him not as useful, but as sacred. People who could sit in silence and still feel connected. People who weren't afraid of the depth. That's the thing about stillness. It doesn't attract everyone, but it attracts the right ones. And in the quiet of his days, in the rhythm of the river, in the whisper of the trees, the man remembered something the world had tried to make him forget. Life is not something to be conquered. It is something to be honored. When you begin the journey back to yourself, it's not the light that welcomes you first. It's the shadows, the corners you've avoided, the truths you've suppressed, the versions of yourself that you packed away and told never to speak again. They rise, not to destroy you, but to be acknowledged, because they too have been part of your becoming. They show up in the quiet moments, in the pause between tasks, in the way your body tenses when someone touches a wound you thought had healed. They whisper reminders, you're not broken, you're just not finished. The man who sat by the river learned this slowly. He didn't arrive at peace by denying his pain. He found peace by making room for it. He stopped asking, what's wrong with me? And started asking, what do I need? And sometimes what he needed wasn't answers. It was presence, a moment of breath, a hand over his heart, a walk in the forest. The way the sunlight filtered through the trees became a kind of scripture. The way the wind touched his skin became prayer. And slowly the internal storm began to soften. He found an old journal one morning, buried in the back of a drawer he hadn't opened in years. Inside were pages filled with thoughts he barely remembered writing. Letters to people he never sent, dreams he had forgotten, fears he never voiced aloud. He read it all, not with judgment, but with tenderness. Because now he understood. Those words were the cries of a man trying to find himself in a world that kept demanding he be someone else. And he made a promise then and there, a quiet vow to his own heart. I will no longer abandon the parts of me that feel too much. He began to carry that journal with him everywhere, not to fill it with answers, but to give his soul a place to breathe. He wrote without filters, without structure, without performance, just feeling, poured onto paper. And through that process, he discovered how healing it is to tell yourself the truth when no one else is listening. There were days he still felt heavy, still felt confused, still felt the ache of past decisions. But instead of pushing those feelings away, he welcomed them like visitors. "Come in," he'd whisper. "Tell me what you've come to teach me." And the lessons were many. That anger, when honored, leads to clarity. That grief, when held, becomes gratitude. That fear, when faced, it transforms into freedom. He also learned the art of waiting, not the passive, impatient kind, the sacred, surrendered kind. He stopped rushing clarity, stopped demanding that every feeling come with a plan. He let things be unresolved, let conversations remain unfinished, let questions go unanswered. And in that waiting, he found wisdom. Because when you no longer rush your process, life reveals its rhythm. And that rhythm, though not always comfortable, is always aligned. There was a boy who used to visit the river sometimes, young, wild-eyed, curious. He would ask the man strange questions, childlike, but profound. Why do people get sad? Do the trees remember us when we're gone? Can a person ever really disappear if someone still loves them? And the man never gave the boy definitive answers. Instead, he'd listen, nod, and sometimes just say, "What do you think?" Because he knew the boy didn't need conclusions. He needed space, space to wonder, space to feel, space to be heard. One day the boy asked, "Were you ever lost?" And the man smiled. Not because the question was amusing, but because it was real. "I was," he said, "for a long time." The boy looked curious. "And how did you get found?" The man thought for a moment. "I stopped trying to be someone I wasn't. And when I did, I realized I was never really lost. I had just forgotten how to listen." The boy nodded like he understood, even if only in the way children understand things with their hearts before their minds catch up. He sat beside the man in silence, watching the river. And in that moment, two souls, one old, one new, shared a sacred understanding that sometimes being is enough. The man had begun to notice the way others lived, always busy, always rushing, always filling the silence with words, the space with things, the discomfort with distraction. He no longer judged it. He had been there too. But he saw it now for what it was, a collective forgetting, a forgetting of what it means to be human, to sit, to feel, to breathe, to belong, not to a crowd, not to an image, but to oneself. He would sometimes watch people pass by on the nearby trail, hikers, tourists, locals. Some would greet him, others would glance at him curiously and walk on. And every once in a while, someone would stop, not to ask for directions, not out of politeness, but because they felt something in his presence, a calm, a clarity, a depth they hadn't touched in a while. They would sit with him, sometimes speaking, sometimes not. And when they left, they'd always say the same thing: "Thank you." Even if no words had passed between them, because some truths don't need language, they're felt. He had become a mirror, not by trying to be, simply by being present. His stillness reflected back to others the parts of themselves they had neglected. His silence gave them permission to listen to their own. And that, he realized, was enough. He didn't need to teach or guide or lead. He only needed to embody, to live the truth he had found in the forest, by the river, within himself. At night, he would sit beneath the stars, watching them blink like ancient eyes. And he would whisper to the sky, not in desperation, but in reverence. "Thank you," he'd say, "for the pain, for the joy, for the journey, for the remembering." And in the hush of night, the stars would blink back, as if to say, "You're welcome." He didn't have many belongings, a few books, some clothes, a blanket passed down from his grandmother, a carving knife, a stone he kept in his pocket, smooth and cool, found on a day when everything felt heavy, and the river reminded him that even the hardest things can be softened over time. And yet, he had never felt so full of presence, full of gratitude, full of truth. He had stopped seeking meaning and started creating it. He had stopped chasing peace and started living it. He had stopped waiting to be saved and remembered he was the one he had been waiting for all along. And now each morning, he rises with the sun, not to conquer the day, not to prove his worth, but to greet himself, to say, "You made it," to stretch his arms wide and inhale the life that has been patiently waiting for him to slow down and receive it. Because life, he has learned, is not about how fast you move. It's about how deeply you feel. It's about how honestly you live. It's about how fully you return to your breath, to your heart, to your truth, to yourself. In the days that followed, the man began to notice the space around him differently, not as something empty, but as something full of invitation. The stillness no longer felt like nothingness. It felt like a welcome. The trees no longer stood as scenery, they stood as elders. The breeze carried something sacred, something that touched not just his skin, but his spirit. And with each breath, with each step on the damp forest floor, he began to remember more of what it means to belong. Not to a place, but to existence itself. He didn't need a title anymore. He didn't need an audience. He didn't even need a reason. He was learning to exist for the sake of being, not for the sake of being seen. He found that some mornings when the mist clung to the leaves and the river was shrouded in quiet fog, a part of him would ache, not with sadness, but with reverence, with awe, with that sacred kind of emotion that has no name, only presence. And it was in those mornings that he felt closest to the version of himself he had forgotten. The one who, as a child, would talk to the sky and believe it listened. The one who believed every falling leaf carried a secret. Every stone had a story. Every gust of wind was a message. He began to see that what he had lost over the years wasn't just innocence. It was intimacy with the world, with mystery, with his own soul. He didn't meditate in the way others did, with mantras or techniques. His meditation was the way his hands moved when he carved patterns into wood, the way he sat with his tea, letting it steep in silence, the way he walked barefoot on the soil, feeling the soft pressure of the earth meeting his skin. It was in the way he paused before speaking, allowing space for truth to surface. It was in the way he listened, not to respond, but to understand. And slowly he became the kind of man whose presence calmed others even when he said nothing at all. He once told a visitor, "We are taught how to speak, but not how to listen. How to plan, but not how to pause. How to give, but not how to receive. And so we rush through life, always chasing, never arriving." The visitor, a woman carrying the weight of too many expectations and too little rest, had tears in her eyes. She hadn't come for wisdom. She'd come for silence, for a space to cry, to unravel. And as she sat with the man by the river, she realized that sometimes the greatest healing doesn't come from advice. It comes from being seen without being judged. She stayed for 3 days, slept beneath the stars, wrote in her journal, cried without explanation, laughed without reason, and when she left, she didn't say goodbye. She simply placed a small stone on the riverbank, her way of saying thank you. And the man understood, because some connections don't need closure. They exist in the space between hello and goodbye, in the space where two souls recognize each other without needing to speak. As more people found their way to the river, not through directions but through intuition, the man began to see something unfolding. Not a community in the traditional sense, not a gathering of seekers or followers, but a constellation of individuals, each on their own journey, each remembering something sacred through the simplicity of presence. They didn't come to learn from him. They came to remember through him, through the way he lived, through the way he noticed things others overlooked. A man came who had lost his daughter. He didn't speak much, just sat by the water and stared. The man offered him tea in silence. No questions, no platitudes, just presence. And one evening, as the fire crackled and the stars blinked like ancient witnesses, the grieving man whispered, "I thought if I stayed busy enough, the pain would forget me, but it didn't." And the river responded with its soft murmuring, as if to say, "You don't need to outrun your grief. You need to let it sit beside you." Another woman came, burnt out from a life of achievement, a leader, a mother, a fixer. She had given so much for so long that she no longer remembered what it felt like to receive. She sat by the fire, looked at the man and said, "I don't know how to let go." He looked at her, not with solutions, but with truth. You don't let go by force. You let go by allowing yourself to be held. She didn't cry that night. But the next morning as she sat by the river, she wept like rain, and no one interrupted her. No one told her to be strong. They just let the sky open within her, and when it passed, she said, "I feel like I can breathe again." These moments didn't make the man feel powerful. They made him feel small in the most sacred way, like he was part of something much bigger, a tapestry of healing that had nothing to do with credentials or teachings and everything to do with truth. He wasn't guiding anyone. He was simply being, and in his being, others found permission to be too. He started carving pieces of wood with words that came to him in silence. "Be here. You are enough. Let it go." He placed them along the trails, on trees, near the river, and people found them like they were meant just for them. They would pick them up, hold them in their hands like relics, sometimes cry, sometimes smile, and leave them where they were, because the message wasn't something to be taken. It was something to be remembered, and through it all, the man remained steady. Not because he was free of pain, but because he no longer feared it. He still had nights where old memories surfaced, where regrets whispered their familiar stories. But he met them with breath, with patience, with love. "You're still here," he would whisper. "That means I'm still learning." And that made him feel whole, not because he had everything figured out, but because he had finally accepted that life wasn't meant to be figured out. It was meant to be lived, fully, deeply, honestly. He watched as seasons changed, the trees shedding their leaves like lessons in release, the river swelling with spring's thaw, the earth warming with the promise of renewal. And each shift mirrored his own. He no longer clung to permanence. He no longer feared change, because he understood now that everything sacred is fluid, that what's meant to stay will stay, and what's meant to leave will teach you something before it goes. One evening, he sat beneath a sky painted in hues of fire and ash, watching the sun melt into the horizon. He whispered a prayer, not to a deity in the clouds, but to the life that pulsed within him. "Thank you," he said, "for breaking me open, for leading me here, for teaching me that I am not here to be fixed. I am here to be felt." And somewhere in the stillness, the earth answered back, not in words, but in the rustle of leaves, the ripple of water, the steady beat of his own heart, a reminder that he had never been alone, not in his pain, not in his healing, not in his remembering. He was at last home. The man had learned that silence speaks more truth than most conversations ever will. In silence, masks fall. In silence, the body tells its secrets. In silence, the soul steps forward and says, "Listen, I've been trying to reach you." And when you learn to listen, not just with your ears, but with your whole being, you begin to hear things that were once drowned out by the noise of doing, like the gentle ache beneath your smile, like the way your breath changes when you're lying to yourself, like the flutter in your chest when you're in the presence of someone who sees you. It's a strange thing to realize that you've spent most of your life in a room filled with people who didn't know your name, not your real name. The name beneath the one given to you. The name written in the vibration of your truth. The name spoken only in moments of deep honesty, when all the layers have been peeled away and only essence remains. He had stopped answering to the version of himself that existed only to keep others comfortable. He no longer jumped to fill silences in conversations. He no longer nodded in agreement just to avoid conflict. He had discovered that peace doesn't come from keeping things quiet. It comes from keeping things honest. People still came to the forest. They arrived tired, overwhelmed, carrying stories too heavy to hold on their own. Some stayed for a few hours, some for a few days. They came not for advice, but for space, and that's what he offered. Space. Safe, sacred, slow space. He had built a small bench beside the river, worn smooth by time and rain, and placed a simple sign nearby. Here you don't need to be anyone. And it worked. People sat down and let themselves unravel. One woman came with a backpack full of letters she had written and never sent. Letters to lovers, to her younger self, to the child she never had. She read them aloud, voice trembling, and when she finished, she placed them into the river one by one, watching the paper melt into water, her past dissolving in ripples. She turned to the man, her eyes red but soft, and said, "I thought I had to carry it all alone, but I was wrong." And he nodded, saying nothing, knowing that some acknowledgments live best in silence. There was a teenager who came, quiet and guarded. His parents had sent him, hoping nature might soften whatever angst was brewing inside him. The boy didn't speak for 3 days. He sat under the same tree, hood over his head, staring into the distance. The man never pushed, never asked why he was there. He simply left him space. On the 4th day, the boy approached him with a single question. "Do you think people can change?" And the man looked at him and said, "I think we're changing all the time. The real question is, are we changing into something true or something we've been told to become?" The boy didn't respond right away. He nodded slowly, like someone hearing their own thoughts spoken aloud. They sat together that evening and watched the sky shift from gold to indigo. The boy shared a few words about pressure, about loneliness, about trying to be good enough, and the man didn't interrupt. Just listened, like he had learned to do. And by the time the boy left, something in his shoulders had softened. Not healed, just softened. And sometimes, that's enough to begin. The man had started to mark the days by the way the light fell through the trees. He no longer wore a watch. Time had become circular to him, not linear. A rhythm, not a race. He began his mornings with a ritual, not elaborate, just intentional. He'd step outside barefoot, feel the earth beneath his feet, close his eyes and whisper 3 words. "I am here." Some days it felt profound. Other days it felt mechanical. But he did it anyway. Not to chase some mystical experience, but to remind himself that being present was a practice, not a destination. He had also learned how to eat slowly, how to let a single bite become an experience, to taste, to chew, to thank. Gratitude had become less of a performance and more of a breath. He no longer wrote long lists of things to be grateful for. He simply noticed the sound of birds returning in spring, the way steam rose from his tea, the way his heart beat slower when he watched fireflies dance in the dusk. He had begun to understand that gratitude was not something you summoned. It was something you allowed. One night, he was visited by an old friend, someone from his life before the forest, a man who had known him in his restless years, when he was climbing ladders that led nowhere, collecting titles that felt empty in his hands. They sat by the fire, and after some time, his friend asked, "Do you ever regret walking away from it all?" The man stared into the flames for a long moment before answering, "I don't think I walked away. I think I finally stopped running." His friend nodded, then whispered, "I wish I could do the same." And the man replied, "You can, but you'll have to let some things die." That truth lingered in the air, heavy, sacred, because letting go always feels like dying. Dying to your old self, to your roles, to the image you've worked so hard to maintain. But on the other side of that death is something extraordinary. rebirth. And not the kind of rebirth that comes with fanfare or transformation montages. It's quieter, gentler. It's the kind of rebirth where one morning you catch your own reflection and realize you're finally looking back at yourself. And that's what the man had come to understand. Healing isn't loud, it's subtle. It's in the way you breathe, the way you hold yourself, the way you stop apologizing for your needs. It's in the way you let yourself take up space, not because you have something to prove, but because you finally know you belong. One afternoon, he was carving a piece of wood when a woman approached him. She had tears in her eyes and said, "I've made so many mistakes. I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself." He paused, looked at her and said, "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about remembering who you were before you started believing you weren't worthy of love." She collapsed into tears and he sat beside her, neither of them saying another word. Sometimes truth is the only sound we need. As the seasons turned, the man began to age. His hair grayed, his steps slowed, but his spirit grew brighter. He was no longer afraid of endings. He welcomed them, because he had learned that every ending is also a clearing, a space for something new to root, to rise. He often said, "We're not here to avoid death. We're here to die many times so we can finally learn how to live." And in his living, he taught nothing, but he showed everything. That stillness is not the absence of life. It is its fullest expression. That presence is not a performance. It is a gift. That truth is not something to find. It is something to remember. And in that remembering, we return, again and again, to ourselves. The forest, with its quiet rhythms and unspoken wisdom, had become the man's teacher. It taught him things no classroom ever could, things that no degree had ever prepared him for. It taught him the language of seasons, the soft surrender of autumn, the still death of winter, the bold rebirth of spring, and the vibrant fullness of summer. In that language, he found metaphors for his own life. He had been through his own autumn, shedding what no longer served him, watching the old identities drift away like leaves in the wind. He had endured his winter, the long nights of doubt, the cold silence of grief, the aching loneliness that comes when you begin to unlearn everything you once called truth. But now in this stage of his life, it felt like spring. Not because everything was blooming all at once, but because something in him had finally thawed. He had stopped resisting, stopped clinging. And in doing so, he made space for life to return in ways he never expected. He had begun to understand that growth doesn't always look like expansion. Sometimes it looks like contraction, like stillness, like saying no, like turning inward. The world often glorifies movement, speed, achievement. But the forest had no interest in hurrying. The river did not rush to meet the ocean. The trees did not compete with each other for sunlight. Everything moved according to its own rhythm, its own truth. And the man had finally given himself permission to do the same. People still found their way to him. Not in large crowds, not in droves, just one soul at a time. Some came with questions, others came with silence. But all of them came carrying something they didn't know how to hold anymore. And the man never tried to carry it for them. He had learned that true healing doesn't happen when someone saves you. It happens when someone reminds you of your own strength. A man came one afternoon, his face tight with years of responsibility. He had been the rock for everyone else, the provider, the protector. But now in the stillness of the forest, he felt like a ghost of himself. He told the man, "I've given everything I have, and I still feel empty." The older man didn't try to fix it. He simply poured him tea and said, "Then it's time to give to yourself." That sentence hit harder than any advice could, because deep down the man already knew. He had just never heard it spoken aloud with such clarity, such permission. Another visitor was a young woman, a survivor of trauma that she had buried so deep. Even she had forgotten parts of it. She came seeking peace but found herself unraveling in the quiet. She wept by the river for hours. She wrote pages and pages in her journal, only to burn them in the fire that night. She didn't say much, but when she left, she hugged the man and whispered, "I remembered something I thought I had lost forever, myself." And that, he believed, was the miracle of stillness. It didn't give you something new. It returned what had always been yours. The man often reflected on his own past, not with regret, but with reverence. He remembered the younger version of himself, the one who had tried so hard to be perfect, who had been terrified of failure, of judgment, of not being enough. He remembered how often he had silenced his own voice just to be accepted, how many times he had said yes when every part of him was screaming no. And he honored that version of himself, not because he had it all figured out, but because he had survived, because he had kept going, even when it didn't make sense, because he had loved, even when it hurt. That younger self wasn't something to be ashamed of. He was the foundation upon which everything else had been built. There's a sacredness in looking back without bitterness, a wisdom that only comes when you've lived enough to know that everything, every mistake, every heartbreak, every misstep was part of your becoming. The man knew now that healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means integrating it, holding it with compassion, saying, "You did the best you could with what you had, and now I choose differently." He had also learned that loneliness and solitude are not the same. Loneliness is the absence of connection. Solitude is the presence of self, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly accompanied by himself. He no longer feared his own company. He no longer needed to be around people to feel whole, and yet, when he was with others, his presence was fuller, richer, because he wasn't trying to get something from them. He was sharing something from within himself. One evening, as the fire crackled low and the stars stretched across the sky like scattered prayers, he sat with a young man who was on the edge of a decision. Stay in a life that looked good on paper but felt hollow, or leap into the unknown and risk losing everything for the sake of something more real. The man didn't offer an answer. He simply told a story. "There was once a bird," he began, "who lived in a beautiful cage. The cage was golden. The food was always there. The cage was cleaned, and people admired the bird for its colors and songs. But the bird never flew. It forgot it had wings. And one day, someone left the cage door open. The bird looked out at the sky and felt something stir. Fear, longing, freedom. It took the bird days to decide. It walked to the edge. It looked back. It wondered if it would survive. But eventually it flew. And the first flight wasn't graceful. It was clumsy. But it was real." The young man nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. He didn't need an answer. He needed the courage to remember his wings. This was the man's gift. Not advice, not solutions, but stories, reflections, reminders. He had become a mirror, a space where people could see themselves more clearly. And he knew that was enough. He no longer craved legacy. He no longer needed recognition. His life was not measured by accomplishments, but by presence, by how deeply he had lived, by how fully he had loved. And he loved deeply. He loved the trees like old friends. He loved the river like a mother. He loved the stars like ancestors. And he loved people, not for what they brought, but for who they were beneath the noise. He saw past their masks, past their defenses, straight into the soft, trembling truth of who they were. And when people are seen like that, they change. Not because they're told to, because they remember they're worth changing for. There were moments when he felt the end approaching, not in fear, but in awareness. His steps slower, his breath deeper, his dreams more vivid. He didn't resist. He welcomed it, because he knew that death was not the opposite of life. It was part of it, a return, a closing of the circle. And when that time came, he hoped it would be in the forest, with the river nearby and the trees standing as silent witnesses. Not because he feared being alone, but because he knew he never really was. But until then, he would rise with the sun. He would greet the day with open hands. He would hold space for those who needed to remember. And he would live, not perfectly, but fully. And that, to him, was enough. There comes a time when the layers of our old selves begin to peel away. Not with a dramatic crash, but with the soft persistence of the morning light, gradually revealing what has always been hidden beneath our masks. In that quiet transformation, you learn that what you once clung to, every expectation, every role you played to please others, every ambition built on the fragile promise of external validation, was never truly yours. It was an echo of what society demanded, a borrowed identity crafted to fit into the narrow spaces defined by others. And as the familiar contours of that borrowed self begin to dissolve, you find yourself in a space of tender uncertainty, a sacred, uncharted territory where the only constant is the gentle beat of your own heart. This is not a crisis, nor is it failure. It is the beginning of a real, unfiltered homecoming to yourself. In the depths of this process, you start to notice the soft rhythms of nature around you, the way the wind caresses the leaves with deliberate slowness, the measured flow of the river that seems to speak in hushed tones of time and impermanence. These natural cadences mirror the inner shift you are undergoing. It is as if the universe, in its boundless wisdom, is inviting you to slow down, to stop chasing the ephemeral, and to start savoring the eternal truth of being. Each step taken in stillness, every moment when you allow yourself to simply exist without the burden of constant doing, becomes a small act of rebellion against a life built on relentless pursuit. And that rebellion is nothing short of sacred. There was a man who, for years, had measured his worth in achievements. Every morning, he woke up with a list of tasks. Every evening, he went to bed counting the boxes checked, believing that success was a series of accomplishments strung together like pearls on a necklace. Yet no matter how many boxes he checked or trophies he won, an empty hollowness grew inside him, whispering that his true self was lost in the noise of expectations. One particularly long night, as the city around him slumbered in a restless quiet, he found himself sitting in his car, staring out at the dark road illuminated only by scattered stars. In that solitude, he felt the weight of every suppressed emotion he had carefully tucked away, every tear he had never allowed to fall, every sigh he had stifled. For hours, he simply sat there, breathing in the chill of the night air, feeling each breath as if it carried the possibility of truth. In that stillness, he began to understand that the accolades and successes, while comforting illusions, could not fill the void left by his abandoned inner self. And slowly, that recognition sparked a yearning for something more authentic, a desire to be whole, to be real, to be enough simply because he existed. Elsewhere, there was a woman whose life had been a constant performance of kindness and obedience. She was the one who always said yes, who never raised her voice, who carefully curated her words so as not to disturb the delicate balance of her surroundings. Everyone saw her as reliable, as the embodiment of grace under pressure. But behind the courteous smile and gentle nod, there lay a quiet storm of unmet desires and unspoken grief. A grief that stemmed from sacrificing her own needs at the altar of what she believed love required. One rainy afternoon, after a day filled with obligations and endless small sacrifices, she sat alone in her small apartment, the sound of rain a steady cadence on the windowpane. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the full force of her solitude. Tears streamed down her face as she realized that in trying to be everything for everyone else, she had forgotten how to be for herself. That recognition was both shattering and liberating. It was as if, by relinquishing the need to please others, she could finally reclaim the parts of her spirit that had been hidden away, waiting for a chance to emerge. She took a deep breath, feeling the damp air fill her lungs. And in that moment, she understood that true fulfillment comes not from endless giving, but from the delicate art of receiving not only love from others, but more importantly, from yourself. Somewhere in the quiet folds of a long-forgotten village, nestled between the arms of ancient trees and the sigh of misty hills, lived a man who had learned to be still. Not because life had been kind to him, not because he had everything figured out, but because somewhere along the way, after losing more than he thought he could bear and surviving more than he expected, he discovered something most people never do: the soul's strength and surrender. He used to be a traveler, not in the romantic sense of adventure, but as a runner. He ran from grief, from shame, from the weight of his own expectations. He carried guilt like a second skin and wore duty like a crown. And then one day, after another sleepless night staring at a ceiling that refused to answer back, he simply stopped. He walked into the woods, sat by a silent river, and didn't move for hours. Not to seek enlightenment, not to find himself, but because he finally admitted he no longer knew what else to do. That admission, that fracture in the armor of certainty, became the doorway to something sacred. Before that day, everything had been a blur of motion. Get up, prove yourself, keep going, make money, stay busy, be strong. Don't cry, don't pause, don't feel too much, just go. And he did, for years, through jobs that drained him, relationships that depleted him, and environments that told him he had to earn his worth through exhaustion. He mastered the art of being acceptable, of showing up in ways that would make others comfortable. He smiled when he wanted to scream. He gave when he was running on empty. And he stayed when his soul was begging to leave. Because deep down, he believed that if he just kept doing the right thing, life would finally reward him with peace. But peace doesn't come from perfection. It comes from presence. And presence is impossible when you're constantly trying to be someone you're not. The man began to notice things in the stillness, the way birds carried stories in their songs, the way the wind whispered secrets if you sat quietly enough, the way his breath had its own rhythm, one he'd ignored for years. He began to feel his body not as a machine to push, but as a sacred vessel asking to be cared for. He noticed how his shoulders relaxed when he stopped pretending, how his stomach stopped nodding when he said what he really meant. He began unlearning the lies that had shaped his identity, the lie that love must be earned, the lie that silence equals safety, the lie that emotions are weaknesses, the lie that being seen in your vulnerability is dangerous. Each morning, he would walk into the forest with no destination. He would listen to the earth speak through the crackling leaves and feel the ancient stillness of trees older than memory. He didn't meditate. He didn't chant. He didn't follow any structure. He just listened. And in that listening, something softened inside him. The judgments began to dissolve. The voices in his head that once screamed, "You're not enough," became whispers. Then silence. Then space. And in that space, he met himself for the first time. Not as a concept, not as a project to be fixed, but as a presence. One morning, he found an old tree stump near the river and sat there watching the water move. He thought about his past, not in a way that hurt, but in a way that humbled. He thought of the people he had lost, the relationships that had unraveled, the moments he thought he would never recover from. And instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" he found himself whispering, "What did this teach me?" That shift from victim to witness changed everything. He saw how every heartbreak had cracked him open, how every failure had humbled his ego, how every loss had stripped away illusions he didn't need. He didn't deny the pain. He didn't minimize the grief. He let them sit beside him like old friends. And he realized healing wasn't about forgetting or pretending it didn't matter. It was about integrating, about holding all of it, joy, pain, regret, love, in the same breath and saying, "You belong here." He remembered a time in his life when he believed emotions were obstacles, when he numbed them with distractions, work, noise, approval, anything to avoid feeling too deeply. But now he let the feelings come. He let them rise and fall like the river. He cried, not because he was broken, but because he was finally whole enough to feel. He laughed, not because everything was perfect, but because he was no longer pretending. And slowly, the man who once lived in reaction began living in reverence. There were days he would sit by the water and feel a strange ache in his chest. Not sadness, but a kind of nostalgia for a version of himself that had never been fully expressed. He thought of the child he used to be, the boy who used to dream without limits, who spoke his truth without fear, who danced without rhythm because the joy in his heart didn't need choreography. And he wept for that boy.